All right, Jim, let's go ahead and knock out a bunch of these Black Op episodes.
Black Op Radio presents 50 Reasons for 50 Years. Why the Warren Commission may be the greatest fraud perpetrated on the American public. Now your host, Len Osanic.
In this episode, we look at the medical evidence. Many trained medical personnel saw a large wound in the back of JFK's head, but this wound is non-existent in the autopsy report and photographs. Author Robert Groden tries to make sense of this contradiction.
The other wound was a fairly large wound on the right side of the head, in the parietal occipital area. Blood and brains with cerebral fragments.
This is Robert Groden. As we approach the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy, it dawns on me that one of the most important issues that we have relates to the medical evidence, and that is the witnesses that actually saw the president's body. When I started interviewing the Dallas doctors back when I worked for the House Assassinations Committee in the late 1970s, I was able to come up with 24 witnesses that saw the president's head and described it. Well, I have a new book coming out, and that new book will show that I have increased the number from the original 24 to now we are up to 81. 81 witnesses saw the president's head.
I looked at the head wound briefly by leaning over the table and noticed that the parietal occipital head wound was largely avulsive. There was visible brain tissue in the card and some cerebellum seen.
What was amazing about this is that every single one of the doctors I spoke to, every one of the witnesses I spoke to, all said that the exit wound was in the rear of the president's head. The massive exit wound is in the rear of the president's head. Why is this important? Well, for two reasons. If the exit wound is in the rear of the head, that means that the shot came from the front. The other thing that it means is that somebody tampered with the photographic evidence because the photographs that show the president's head show the rear of the head to be intact. The autopsy photographs have been faked. Now, who could have done that? They were in possession of the National Archives and the government the whole time since they were taken by elements of the Department of the Navy until now. These photographs are the most important evidence since the Zapruder film. And the fact that the photographs have been faked and the fact that the witnesses were ignored by every investigation that's ever looked at the president's assassination shows that we are dealing with not just mistakes, not just a matter of opinion, but we're dealing with a massive cover-up from the highest levels of government.
The final report of the House Select Committee, published in 1979, claimed that the Dallas witnesses were mistaken about a rear head wound because all the witnesses at Bethesda Hospital testified to the committee that such a wound was not observed there. But when the classified interviews were released in the 1990s, it turned out that most of the Bethesda witnesses indeed also saw a large wound in the back of Kennedy's head. The individuals responsible for writing the HSCA's final report have all denied responsibility for reporting this false information.
Stay tuned for the next installment as we expose week after week 50 lies the Warren Commission would like you to believe.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, episode 25 in the inconsistencies in the X-ray photos.
Well, much better persons to have done this would have been either David Lifton, who was really the first to realize that there'd been this alteration of the body and the great expansion of the head wound, or rather David W. Mandig, who's the leading expert in the world on the medical evidence today. The real reason for discounting the witnesses wasn't actually the Bethesda witnesses, but the autopsy X-rays, which don't show it. Where Mantic went into the National Archives and applied a simple technique from physics known as optical densitometry and defined an area that had been altered by either using a material much too dense to be human bone or exposing it to very intense light as a form of masking to conceal that blowout to the back of the head, which when he defines it represents a very substantial blowout that is very like frame 374 of the Zapruder film, where you can see it. And I say very appropriately, to go further on this, review my article in Veterans Today entitled "The Challenging Case of Robert Groden," because there I show you the blowout and compare it with the x-rays of David Mantic, so that the key reason why, how we know it was covered up, was by altering the x-rays, which appears to have been done by John Ebersol, who was the acting radiation officer at Bethesda at the time, and where David offers a critical commentary of Ebersol's testimony in Murder in Dealey Plaza. Really very, very important. So much more could have been done here had there been a person who actually knew this aspect of the case better.
All right, on to episode 26, we have Pat Speer describing the back wounds.
Why the Warren Commission may be the greatest fraud perpetrated on the American public. Now your host, Len Osanic.
This episode, we discuss the president's back wound, which the Warren Commission had to move up to the neck to make their scenario plausible. By withholding actual photos and using an artist's rendition derived solely from Dr. Humes and Boswell's memories, the Warren Commission managed to sell this lie as long as the public never saw the original photos. Author, researcher, Pat Speer explains how they did this.
This is Pat Speer, creator of The Mysterious Death of Number 35 video series and the author of a free book on the assassination at patspeer.com. On the evening of November 22, 1963, an autopsy was conducted on Kennedy's body by Drs. Humes, Boswell, and Fink. While examining the president's body, they noted a tracheotomy incision on Kennedy's throat and a bullet hole in his back, and marked these on a face sheet, an outline of a body in which wounds are noted. The next morning, Dr. Humes supposedly called Dr. Perry, the emergency room doctor who tried to save Kennedy's life in Dallas. Perry told Humes that the tracheotomy incision was cut through a small bullet wound on Kennedy's throat. This led Humes to conclude the bullet entering Kennedy's back had exited Kennedy's throat. There was a problem with this, however. Kennedy was believed to have been shot from the 6th floor of a building barely 60 yards behind him, and the back wound on the face sheet was below the level of the throat wound. This problem was first noted by Warren Commission General Counsel J. Lee Rankin in the January 27, 1964 executive session of the Warren Commission. Rankin told the commissioners that he'd be seeking some help from the doctors on this issue, and this help was soon to come. In preparation for their March 16, 1964 testimony before the commission, Drs. Humes and Boswell were asked to prepare some schematic drawings demonstrating the location of Kennedy's wounds and the paths of the bullets through his body. These drawings showed the back wound to be well above the throat wound and consistent with a shot fired from 6 stories up and 60 yards or more behind. This solution to the problem, however, made at least one member of the commission's staff nervous. On April 30th, 1964, Arlen Specter, the future senator, and the counsel charged with taking all the medical testimony, dashed off a memo to General Counsel Rankin. He wrote that, in preparation of the commission's upcoming reenactment of the shooting, it is essential for the commission to know precisely the location of the bullet wound on the president's back, so that the angle may be calculated. And this was doubly important because commission exhibits numbers 385, 386, and 388 were made from the recollections of the autopsy surgeons as told to the artist. Someday, someone may compare the films with the artist's drawings and find a significant error which might substantially affect the essential testimony and the commission's conclusions. Specter was shown the autopsy photo of Kennedy's back wound on May 24, 1964, the day of the commission's reenactment. It shows the wound to have been on Kennedy's back. And yet, from the day of the reenactment, in the chapters Specter wrote for the Warren Commission, and in his subsequent writings and interviews, he almost always said this wound was at the base of the back of Kennedy's neck. And it's worse than that. Although Specter knew full well the chalk mark used to mark Kennedy's wound location during the reenactment was on his back, he took the testimony of Agent Thomas Kelly on June 4, 1964, and asked Kelly the basis for the marking on the wound on the back of the president's neck, and said nothing as Kelly falsely claimed it had been commissioned CE 386, which showed the wound to be at the base of the back of the neck. Speer then made sure that the only photo of his trajectory analysis entered into evidence failed to show the chalk mark. What was Speer up to? Was he lying to hide that Kennedy's and Connolly's wounds didn't align with a shot from the sniper's nest, and that the medical evidence failed to support the conclusions the commission had already come to? It appears so.
Both of these are blow-ups from the Warren Commission report. Now, there are people who think they see discrepancies in that this drawing, what you've called an entry wound at the base of the neck of the president, shows it to be, or seems to show it to be, in the upper back near the shoulder blade, considerably below the base of the neck, whereas this drawing does show the entry wound to be at the base of the neck. Now, could you talk about these and reconcile that?
Yes, sir. This first drawing is a sketch. These are on sheets of paper present in the room in which examination is conducted and are routinely used to mark in general, we feel, that the measurements which are noted here at the margins of the drawing are the precise measurements which we took. Now, the acromion is the extreme outermost portion of the shoulder. The tip of the mastoid is a bony prominence just behind the ear. And where these two lines intersect was, in actuality, where this wound was situated. Now, the second drawing, which you mentioned, was prepared to rather schematically and as accurately as we possibly could depict the story for the members of the Warren Commission.
In this drawing, you were trying to be precise.
Yes, sir, we were. We were trying to be precise and refer back to our measurements that we had made. Also, of course, since this time, we had opportunity to review the photographs which we made. These photographs show very clearly that the wound was exactly where we stated it to be in our testimony before the Warren Commission.
Your re-examination of the photographs verify that the wounds were as shown here?
Yes, sir, they do.
In 1978, Dr. Michael Boden, speaking before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, testified that a panel of 9 top forensic pathologists had concluded that the wound Speer and the Warren Commission had declared was at the base of the back of the neck and well above the throat wound was in fact on Kennedy's back and below the throat wound. This was huge news. These doctors, moreover, had decided that the trajectory of a bullet connecting this wound with the wound on Kennedy's throat was inconsistent with Kennedy's forward lean in the Zapruder film unless he'd been hit while behind the sign in the film. This was a problem for the House Select Committee in that their photographic panel has simultaneously concluded Kennedy had been hit before going behind the sign in the film. This problem was quickly overcome. A trajectory panel had been given the authority to move the locations of Kennedy's wounds in order to make the trajectories work. And so it's true. On September 7, 1978, Dr. Michael Boden testified that the back wound at the base of Kennedy's neck in Warren Commission Exhibit 385 was 2 inches too high, only to have trajectory expert Thomas Canning present exhibits 5 days later with a wound in this identical location. So why move the wound upwards? Well, connecting the location of the back wound as interpreted by the pathology panel with the location of the throat wound as interpreted by the pathology panel leads right through Kennedy's first rib and spine. The single bullet trajectory doesn't work, and a number of those tasked with investigating Kennedy's assassination were more than aware of this, and yet chose to say nothing. If all the shots came from the sniper's nest in the manner described by the government, why did the government's investigators so obviously and so brazenly lie?
All right, Dr. Fetzer, Pat Speer's second time at bat. Go ahead.
Well, Pat Speer gives it a go. I think there's a whole lot more that could have been said, which I said in a presentation at Cambridge, which I then published in a peer-reviewed international journal. Check out Reasoning About Assassinations. We have the shirt he was wearing, the jacket he was wearing, both of which have holes about 5.5 inches below the collar to the right of the spinal column. We have the autopsy diagram, which they here sought to obfuscate, showing a location on the body at that same corresponding location. We have an FBI diagram showing the wound to the back much lower than the wound to the throat. We have the president's personal physician's death certificate, which locates the wound to the back at the level of T3, which corresponds to that same location 5.5 inches below the collar. We have the mortician's description of the wound as between 5 and 6 inches below the collar. Plus, of course, David W. Mantic took a patient with similar chest and neck dimensions and created a CAT scan and plotted the official trajectory at the base of the neck and coming out the front of the neck, and found it's not even anatomically possible because cervical vertebrae intervene. Plus, of course, when Malcolm Perry participated in the Parkland press conference shortly after Malcolm killed off the acting press secretary, announced the president was dead, he described the wound to the throat 3 different times as a wound of entry. 3 different times as a wound of entry. The bullet was coming at him. It was a wound of entry. And, of course, this was a monstrous problem for the Warren Commission because 2 wounds, the wound to the throat and the wound to the right temple, which blew out the back of his head, had been widely described on radio and television that day, including on NBC, See It Now, where you have Chet Huntley, among others, reporting the wound to the throat and the entry wound to the right temple, and attributing that finding to Admiral George Berkeley, the president's personal physician, such that later in the evening, as reports are trickling in about the shooter having been above and behind, Frank McGee, who was nobody's fool, says, this is incongruous. How can the man have been shot from in front, from behind? Which, of course, the Warren Commission accommodated by reversing the trajectories and using Arlen Specter and others to lie about the location of the wound. So while Pat Speer has the big picture right, there are a great many corroborating details that confirm it, which are not presented in this episode.
All right, you're listening to Patriot Radio. The show is completely dedicated to the Jim Garrison investigation.
Black Op Radio presents 50 Reasons for 50 Years. Why the Warren Commission may be the greatest fraud perpetrated on the American public. Now your host, Len Osanic.
80 minutes after the president had been shot down, Lee Oswald was taken into custody and identified as not just the prime suspect, but the only suspect.
These people have given me a hearing without legal representation or anything.
Did you shoot the president?
I didn't shoot anybody, no, sir.
You just heard Oswald, who said he did not shoot anybody.
The scene at Dallas Police Headquarters verged on chaotic as scores of newsmen crowded hallways while police paraded evidence and the suspect before the cameras.
You fire that rifle? That's as fast as you people have been given, but I emphatically deny these charges.
Oswald has hustled through a doorway.
Not committed any acts of violence.
He says he has nothing against anybody. He has not committed any act of violence. Are you and the rest of the police convinced you have the right man now? I think we do. But so far he's given absolutely no sign of weakening under the questioning? No. Are there any other suspects linked with Oswald?
No. Just after 9 p.m. on the Friday night, a paraffin test was conducted to determine the presence of nitrates on Lee Oswald's hands and cheek, which could indicate whether he had handled a firearm. The test was negative for his right cheek, showing to an 80% certainty that Oswald had not fired a rifle that day. Despite this, Lee Oswald was officially charged.
He's been charged with both killing Officer Tippin and John F. Kennedy. I figure we have sufficient evidence to convict him. There's no one else but him.
So just what was the evidence against Lee Oswald at the time of his arraignment? He supposedly matched the descriptions. He worked at the building where the shots were believed to have been fired. He was missing from the building in the aftermath of the shooting. He was a suspect in the murder of a policeman. He once defected to Russia and more recently had been handing out pro-Castro literature in New Orleans. That's it.
I can tell you that this case is cinched, that this man killed the president. There's no question in my mind about it.
Is there any doubt in your mind, Chief, that Oswald is the man who killed the president?
I think this is the man that killed the president.
Is there any indication from the investigation to date that would indicate motive on the part of Mr. Oswald?
So far as I know, there's no indication of it.
Do you have anything other than circumstantial evidence right now?
Well, we have some physical evidence.
Can you tell us anything about that physical evidence?
No, sir, I wouldn't.
Do you feel that this case is proceeding as efficiently as you would like it to proceed, or are some doubts beginning to grow as to whether this, in fact, is the man?
No doubts are beginning to grow, but it's a very difficult investigation.
Here is Lee Oswald, the ex-Marine accused of killing President Kennedy. How would you describe his mood during the questioning?
Very arrogant. Has been all along.
What does he say, Chief?
He just denies everything.
Does he say anything else?
Not too much.
Is he responding to questions? Is he refusing to answer questions at this stage?
He doesn't answer questions except to say that's ridiculous, that's silly, that's and deny any knowledge of everything.
2 pieces of evidence linking Oswald with the rifle found on the 6th floor were being evaluated through the day. A mail order form had been discovered which apparently linked Oswald and Hadal to the purchase and delivery of the same model of Italian rifle. But anomalies and inconsistencies with this evidence is such that if Oswald had ever gone to trial, the mail order rifle story would have been vigorously challenged. Photographs had also come to light which appeared to depict Oswald posing with the same rifle. What came to be known as the backyard photos, they were handled or seen by at least 4 witnesses on Friday night, including Michael Payne, who testified as such to the Warren Commission. Captain Fritz recorded in his notes that he had seen the photos about midday on Saturday, but officially the photos had not yet been discovered and wouldn't be until a few hours later in Ruth Payne's garage. The rifle information and the photos were introduced to the media hastily early Saturday evening, helping to prop up a sense of certainty that the case was proceeding smoothly.
The FBI has just informed us that they have the order letter for the rifle. This order letter has been to the laboratory in Washington, D.C., and compared with known handwriting of our suspect, Oswald, and the handwriting is the same on the order letter as Oswald's handwriting. The return address on this order letter was to the post office box in Dallas, Texas, of our suspect, Oswald.
What's the development you referred to today as making the case ironclad, in your opinion?
Referring to the photograph earlier? No.
Where did these photographs come from, Chief?
The photographs were found in out at Irving.
I'm pretty certain this is the rifle that killed the president.
Yes.
Do you consider the case shut tight now, Chief?
We will continue to work on it and try to get every shred of evidence that's possible.
Lee Oswald made 2 phone calls Saturday night. One, at 8 p.m., lasted for 30 minutes, and despite being monitored by several persons, who Oswald called and what was discussed has never been disclosed. At 10:45 p.m., Oswald attempted to place another call, collect, to North Carolina. He had 2 phone numbers, both listed to a John Hurt, 2 separate persons. How Oswald had these numbers is not known. One of the John Hurts had previously served in military intelligence, and researchers have speculated that Oswald may have been trying to talk to a cutout. The call was not permitted to go through. These 2 Saturday evening calls are not mentioned in the Warren report anywhere.
Oswald has made his latest flat denials in the face of a mounting pile of evidence against him. The last links in this case seem to be coming into place tonight. Police have
Throughout the weekend, the entire case against Lee Oswald was based on circumstantial evidence at best. A few years later, in a memoir, Dallas Police Chief Curry would sum up, "We don't have any proof that Oswald fired the rifle, and never did. Nobody's yet been able to put him in that building with a gun in his hand." One can speculate what might have happened if Lee Oswald had ever gone to trial, but in reality, as the weekend played out, there was an unmistakable sense that Oswald's goose had already been cooked.
We see where Oswald will enter the courthouse. So far, as you know, he's refused to confess. He's been under intermittent questioning now for almost 2 days. The case against him is airtight, but he still doggedly holds out.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, the case against Oswald and the lack of evidence thereof, and Henry Wade. Go ahead.
Len Osanic does a good job as far as it goes. There's much more that could be said. Notice he begins by observing he was arrested 80 minutes after the shooting at 12:30. That would be 1:50 at the Texas Theater, which corresponds to other sources about the time that he was arrested. However, the arrest report on Oswald, which states definitively that this man shot and killed President John F. Kennedy and police officer J.D. Tippit and wounded Governor Connally, is actually timed at 1:40 or 10 minutes early. About the nitrate report, he could have also observed that while there were residues of nitrate on Oswald's hands, that was to be expected because he worked in a book depository. Books are printed in ink, and ink contains nitrates. So that had an innocuous explanation, but the fact that they were still there proved that he had not washed the nitrates off of his cheek, because in the process he would also have washed them off his hands. So the nitrate evidence is even more exculpatory than Len emphasized. Plus, of course, we know that the backyard photographs were faked. Jim Mars and I have published an article about it explaining how the chin is not the Oswald chin, that there's an insert line between the chin and the lower lip, that the shadows are not right, that the fingertips of the right hand are cut off, that the face, although there are several of these photographs, the face is identical in each of the four, which were taken in different poses at different times and is therefore an optical impossibility. And that using the newspapers as an internal yardstick, you can determine the height of the individual in the photograph. He turns out to be only about 5'6", much too short to be Oswald, whether he was 5'9" or 5'10", which means that either they used someone to stand in for him who was too short, or more likely that they introduced the newspapers too large when they fabricated this photograph. The study is entitled Framing the Patsy, the Case of Lee Harvey Oswald, where we also cite the work of Jack White that preceded us, and where Judith Berry Baker, who's proven to be a very adept student of the case, has been able to establish her own, on the basis of her own research, that those backyard photographs were fabricated or faked. So as Jesse Curry would later report, they have no evidence that, in fact, he actually owned the rifle or that he had been in the building using the rifle. In fact, we know he was actually on the front steps at the time the shooting was taking place, and therefore not only cannot have been the lone demented assassin, but wasn't even one of the gunmen. And where, by the way, let me mention what Len also overlooked, namely that we have two evidence photographs, one the Dallas Police Department evidence photograph, the other an FBI photograph showing two spent and one unspent shell cartridge from the scene. The evidence photographs, of course, are a recording of the available evidence and have legal standing. And in neither case do we have three spent shell casings, so that far from the case being cinched, you have Henry Wade and Will Fritz just, knowingly lying, and Jesse Curry, who I'm afraid was being played as a stooge here, making false statements about the case. But I like what Len did. It's just there's a whole lot more that could have been said here.
I guess that'll close out episode 27. And a side note, I always found it fascinating that the landmark abortion case, Roe versus Wade, was actually Henry Wade, the same person in this episode.
Well, that's fascinating.
It sure is. Okay, let's go into episode 28, when things went horribly wrong, and the first televised murder ever. And this is about when Ruby takes center stage.
Sunday morning, November 24th, 1963, after the initial shock of the assassination, the nation had been assured that Lee Oswald was the lone killer and the evidence against him was solid. His transfer to the county courthouse would begin a new phase leading towards the January trial. All in all, there was a sense that things would slowly return to normal. Even the television news felt free to return to what it did best: banal human interest stories.
In the distance, the area directly adjacent to the assassination point, the park area where during the past 24 hours numerous floral wreaths have been laid by various Dallas citizens and organizations. The first floral arrangement was placed early yesterday morning by a lone man with a simple inscription:
Bob Walker, WFAA-TV, Dallas, Texas, interrupting. There's been a shooting at Dallas Police Station as Oswald was being transferred. For details, Bill Lord, ABC at City Hall. Bill.
Just 1 minute ago, they were bringing Oswald out. He had apparently changed clothes. He was just going out the door, heading towards the armored car, and there was a bang. We believe it was a shot.
Is there someone down on the floor over there? Is there someone injured down on the floor?
Apparently, Oswald.
Apparently, Oswald is the word we get.
He is shot.
He is shot. Oswald is shot. It is Oswald. Come back. Being wheeled out. He was shot in the lower left side. Put in a police ambulance.
The transfer was occurring late. There were a number of officers around. There seemed to be unusual security precautions. At the last minute, they moved all of the cameramen outside the area, except for 2 of us, and we moved back instead of out to the driveway. I made the shot of Oswald coming out of the elevator through the grill work in the sergeant's office, followed him as far as I could, then moved to the glass doorways, and were shooting at the back of the officers surrounding him as they carried him toward moved him toward the car. At that time, a shot rang out. I suppose I was within 10 feet of the man.
Now, as Oswald was escorted out, were the policemen to either side of him? Weren't there any in front of him?
Yes.
How did the man get by the policeman in front?
The only thing I know is someone said he jumped.
Police using flashlights had searched the entire basement area. Officers with riot guns and rifles were posted throughout the basement area. All persons entering the basement area had been checked and cleared by the police. All newsmen had been required to show credentials before being allowed into the basement area.
Now, do I believe that you recognize this man after the capture?
Yes, sir.
Did I understand you to say that if you had seen him before, you would have ejected him?
Yes, sir.
More caution and protection had been used for this man than anything had ever been seen in the city of Dallas. In fact, Dallas City Hall is normally a public building, but today it was really under armed guard.
Jack.
Is this a confirmed report as to who did the shooting?
As far as I know, I just got it from Vic Robertson.
Vic Robertson from City Hall reports that Jack Ruby, the owner of the Carousel, which is a bar in Dallas, did the shooting. Now, Oswald being brought out of the ambulance, taken to emergency ward at Parkland Hospital. Same entrance, same door, which President Kennedy was taken just 2 days ago.
Lee Oswald is currently undergoing surgery for a single gunshot wound.
You indicated that you had made some preparations for this eventuality.
We had received word that there was quite a crowd down there, and on the possibility that there might be some type of disorder, we had alerted our emergency room to be prepared.
What's your reaction to hearing that suspect Oswald has been shot down?
Well, I can't hardly say what right now, but I think that the people wanted a quick decision on his execution.
I did not mean to imply that we had anticipated that there would be a shooting.
Young man, how do you feel about it?
Well, I don't think anything can be too bad for him, and maybe trial wouldn't have done anything different. He would have been shot anyway.
Rumors and threatening calls have been spreading throughout the city for the past several hours. There are many, many stories currently going around, some possibly linking Ruby to the latest dead man, Lee Oswald. Ma'am, how do you feel about the shooting of Oswald?
Well, I just feel like this is too good for him. I think he should have had a trial. And I think he should have got suffered more than what he has suffered now, and longer.
C.J. Price, who is our administrator, called me on the telephone and told me that in view of the fact that a crowd had gathered down there for the transfer, that we should alert the emergency room in case any type of disorder was involved in the transfer, and we would need our emergency facilities.
Did police inform him of the crowd, or how did he determine that the crowd was there? And that...
To my knowledge, this was based on his own intuition.
There were no clear-cut defining points involved in the initial assassination. Now this only compounds it. It will be remarkable to find, when the story is eventually known, what actually did happen.
Almost 50 years later, we still don't really know what happened.
Stay tuned for the next installment as we expose week after week 50 lies the Warren Commission would like you to believe.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, Oswald assassinated in front of the nation.
Well, Len Osanic does a good job with this, but there's more to be said. They switched him into a dark sweater so that when he was shot, you couldn't tell where the blood was located, what kind of wound he'd sustained. They apparently gave him CPR in the ambulance on the way to Parkland Hospital, which is inappropriate with a victim who has an internal injury like this because it makes the blood flow faster. Charles Crenshaw MD, who'd been present in Trauma Room 1 when JFK was brought in, was responsible for the treatment of Lee Oswald in Trauma Room number 2, and received a phone call. He was notified by the operator for the hospital that the president wanted to speak to him, and Lyndon Johnson told him when he answered the call that he wanted a deathbed confession from the suspect. Crenshaw explained to LBJ that he didn't expect that to happen because there was he was improving at that point in time. Johnson said there would be a man there to take the confession before he hung up. When Crenshaw returned, there was a sinister-looking fellow in a trench coat whom I believe may have been David Sanchez Morales, a notorious CIA assassin. But Oswald took a turn for the worst, and there would be no deathbed confession. He died without regaining consciousness. The fact is, of course, we know that Lee and Ruby knew each other. And in fact, Beverly Oliver, on one occasion when she visited the Carousel Club, was called over by Jack Ruby and said, "Hey, I want you to meet my friend Lee Oswald of the CIA." We also know that Ruby was one of the only conspirators who had a conscience and who observed to reporters that if someone else had been vice president, this would never have happened. And they asked him, did he mean the man in office now? And he confirmed, yes, he did. And, of course, the evidence that implicates Lyndon Johnson as the key facilitator in bringing about the assassination is simply overwhelming.